Welcome to the Empowered to Connect podcast, where we come together to discuss a healing-centered approach to engagement and well-being for ourselves, our families, and our communities. I'm JD Wilson, and I'm your host. And today on the show, we got therapist Rocky Anthony joining us to begin the conversation of what honestly could be an entire separate podcast in and of itself, but the topic of grief and loss. And how do we begin thinking through that from a both a personal standpoint as well as a parenting standpoint? How does it affect our relationships? How do we help our kids begin processing it and walking through it in a healthy way? We cover all those topics and more with Rocky, and you're just going to love him. He's a patient, empathetic, compassionate, kind, wise, generous guy, somebody that we've known around ETC for years, and just a great person. So can't wait to share this interview with you. Right now, here he is, Rocky Anthony. Well, okay, we're here today with Rocky Anthony, and Rocky, among other things, is a therapist in Memphis, Tennessee, and so we wanted to gather with him today to talk about grief and loss. And so, Rocky, thank you, first of all, for being here. And before we jump into our topic today, which is, could potentially be pretty deep and heavy to walk through, why don't we just kind of let folks know who you are and what you do?
JD, thank you so much. It's really great to be with you today. So thanks for the invite on that. I know this is a full week for many of us as we just really try to circle around gratitude.
Yeah.
And let's be honest, sometimes grief gets in the way of gratitude.
Oh, man. Yes.
So a little bit about me. I'm a native of St. Louis, born in Chicago. But really have been here in Memphis for about 30 years.
Okay.
And my wife, Tracy, and I have what are now 4 adult children. So all of them were born in the South. So I'd like to say, having been here for 30 years, that, I'm kind of a Southerner. I can pull off things like, hey, I'm fixing to carry you down to the store. So I've learned things like that just to get by. Since being in Memphis, I spent about 20 or so years in a pastoral role at a large church here in Memphis, but really always focused ultimately where my heart really has been on soul care and really trying to help people really develop souls that would allow them to know God, commune with God, and develop deeper intimacy with God. For these last 9 or so years, I've been in a role of being a counselor to a community called a Memphis Teacher Residency, and that is a group of educators who are serving in schools around Memphis, particularly in the urban area of Memphis, some of the most needy schools in terms of academic advancement and whatnot, a lot of the under-resourced. My role is really just to come alongside these educators and do everything I can just to encourage them in their emotional and mental and spiritual lives in the hard work that they do. And that particular group, if you want to look at memphistr.org, is just a phenomenal group of people who are really every day in the trenches trying to make a difference.
Yeah. As every teacher now scribbles down, we need a counselor in our group.
No, it's a joy to be able to do that, just to encourage these folk just to be able to thrive in the midst of the hard.
Yeah.
And, much as possible, God help us to move towards sustainability.
Yeah. Man. Well, we've obviously been friends for a while now, and know each other well through multiple different contexts. But we wanted to have you on, particularly today, just to begin to talk about. A lot of your work is working with people who are working in pretty difficult contexts where their population is experiencing grief and loss at a pretty rapid rate. You mentioned grief getting in the way of gratitude sometimes as we approach not just Thanksgiving, but the whole holiday season. This little bugger, grief and loss in our lives, can pop up at the absolute worst times and just make life a nightmare. And so we wanted to begin, especially in light of our conversation last week with the adoption triad, we just wanted to begin kind of outlining what is grief, what is loss, how can we then get our hands around it? So why don't we kind of start there? Would you mind just sort of defining grief for us or loss and talking about what it does to us?
Well, if we're going to just maybe start with maybe a more technical definition of grief, many people are familiar with the 5 stages of grief. I'll maybe revisit that in just a moment, but just generally, this idea of grief is just the loss, particularly the loss of someone or something that has died. And when you have formed deep levels of emotional connection to that person, and those bonds are rich, and you lose that person, it impacts you emotionally, it impacts you cognitively, it impacts you relationally. And I've said this for years: the greater the bond, the greater the grief.
Yeah. Right.
And that could be a person for sure. That could be an animal.
Right.
That could be a city that you leave. That could be a lot of things. But I think most often when we think about grief, we think of a person that we've loved that is no longer in our life.
Yeah.
And I think when we think about adoption, that could be, there's grief. That person could still be alive, but they're not in our life.
Yeah. Yeah.
In the way that we want them to be.
Right.
So there's a lack of connection. There's a lack of ability to celebrate the presence of that person in our lives.
And as we're thinking about how that begins to affect us. Maybe we'll start from more of a parenting level. A lot, we talk all the time on the show here about how, unfortunately, we bring all of ourselves to parenting, like it or not. So we bring all of our past, all of our baggage, all of our good, bad, and ugly. It all comes with us into that parenting arena. So how can it's kind of some unresolved grief, unresolved loss, or even, loss that we've tried to process well, how can that affect us in that parenting realm?
JD, what you just said, I think is really, really important. What I just heard you say is we bring all of our past, we bring all of our, to the parenting process or to whatever process. One of the things that you and I have talked about in the past, and this comes from really the recovery world. And I'll just give you this phrase: expectations are premeditated resentments.
Yeah.
We could change that phrase around, but I think one of the things that creates, in that phrase, we're using resentments, but we could almost morph that and say expectations have a way of stirring up, greater levels of grief. Because I think we bring to a situation a set of, hey, it should be this or it should be that.
Yeah.
And I think we're moving into, a holiday season. We have different ideas of nostalgia, or we have different views of what a person like me would call magical thinking, and things don't go that way. And so there's expectations that create for us, and we're kind of doing it to ourselves, heightened levels of grief because we want things to go a certain way. And so we're not able to kind of like deal with life on life's terms. The loss is hard enough,
Right.
but then we add to it these other expectations for the way we think life should be going. And it creates even a greater gap. If our listeners could see what I'm doing here for you on the screen, I have one hand up in the air and one hand below that. There's a life that we want, and then below that, there's a life that we have.
Yeah.
And I think, sadly, tragically, so many of us were like, "Hey, there's a life that we want, and that's up here, and it's without problems, it's without struggles. I want this person back in my life, or I want these things to go that way." But then here's reality. There's a life I have.
Yeah.
And what separates those two is this thing called a gap. And I think so many of us are trying to find a way to close that gap.
Mm-hmm.
Rocky calls that gap management living. and it's an exhausting way to live life.
Yes.
There's this word acceptance, which is able to say, there is a life I have. That doesn't mean quitting.
Right.
But that does mean acceptance. And this really does have a lot to say and inform us around grief, to say, okay, that if I could go circle back around the 5 stages of grief, that is the last of the 5 stages. There's denial, there's anger, there's bargaining, which is, I'm going to figure out a way to make this work for me. There's denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then there's finally acceptance. There's the life I have. I know that was a lot.
No, that's great. So let's take a right turn there for a second and stay in this lane. So we get to a place of acceptance, and oftentimes what I feel like happens is that acceptance and depression sort of weave in and out of each other. Acceptance, but then the depression of, but I really did want this. I know I've just got this life, but I really did want this. So how do we begin to reconcile that in a place of making peace with ourselves?
Well, I think first of all to say, let's give all of ourselves like a big dose of grace. Welcome to humanity. I think of Paul's words, the Apostle Paul's words. He's in a jail in Philippi. It's certainly not where he wanted to be.
Yeah.
He was a traveling church planter, and then he finds himself literally chained in a jail. But this is what he says: I learned the secret of being content.
Yeah.
And I'm like, thank you so much. Because, and whether we're going to say contentment or we're going to say peace,
yeah,
it's like we enroll in that school, and it's not that we ever like get there and they're like, oh boy, I'm glad I'm in the land of peace. Now I can just ride that out and enjoy that. Like for the, how do alcoholics stay sober every day? Or they do it one day at a time.
Right. Yeah, that's true.
How did Paul? He learned that, and I think he learned that little by slow.
Yeah.
And in some ways, JD, there's no magic formula for that. But I think there are practices that help us to like ground ourselves daily, so that it's more likely that we would experience that.
That's really great. That's great. So, when we are getting to a place of starting to grieve losses that are happening, maybe they've been things that have been we've not allowed ourselves to really dive into because they hurt too much, and we're saying, you know what, now's the time. I want to start thinking through that. Is there a kind of starting out kind of a pathway to grieving healthily that we can share with our listeners today, like a first few steps of here's some guidelines to give you as you begin to grieve through loss?
Well, I just think about my own experience. Yeah, I've lost both my parents. My wife has lost both her parents. And I'm just thinking about even some conversations I've been having recently, as we're moving into the holidays. And it's just interesting, kind of the way so many of us tend to handle our own grief. Let's just be real practical. Like when we think about somebody that we love who's maybe no longer with us, and whether that's that they've died or they're not present and we're grieving their absence.
Mm-hmm.
And the thought of them creates sadness, right? And so here's the first temptation. The first temptation is that feeling of sadness is uncomfortable. And so I'm going to try just to put them out of my mind.
Yeah.
So I thought about them. That makes me sad. And so I'm going to try to just like sweep that memory, that person out of my mind. And I'm like, that's one way. But I think maybe a more healthy approach is just to learn to embrace that memory and accept that memory as a memory of a kind learning to embrace that memory with kindness.
Yeah.
And learn to sit in it. And not to identify that always with sadness.
Yeah.
Remember, the greater the love in the relationship, right? In a sense, the greater the pain. I've always said to people, in a sense, your scar is a tribute to the love you've had for this person. I always like to think of it as like a beauty mark on your heart.
Yeah.
Okay. And so rather than, I just got to rush this out of my mind. No. Give yourself a moment just to in the present to reflect on that person. Gosh, I love them so much. And even just to say, okay, what is the treasured moment I have with them? And to dwell on that and to breathe and to be in that for a moment. And I just think we could have a long conversation. You and I could, even on this broadcast, about, and I'm sure you have in past power of neuroplasticity, right?
Yeah.
And so instead of we call this ants, automatic negative thoughts, right? And so instead of that memory creating an automatic negative thought, the power of the mind to say, no, whenever I think of that person, I'm going to allow my mind to begin to think about that person with kindness and beauty.
Mm-hmm.
And just receive that as a gift from God.
And we talked about that neuroplasticity, the ability for your brain over time to be able to reshape those memories and to reclaim territory, so to speak, in that arena. And that is, gosh, that's beautiful. Yeah.
We can maybe summarize this a whole lot with a whole lot fewer words. Not to be afraid of that thought.
Yeah.
But just to welcome it with a sense of curiosity and anticipation.
Yeah.
I think when we're afraid of it, it has the wrong kind of power over us.
Yeah. Gosh, especially when there's complex memories attached to it, seasonally and otherwise, right? What about for our kids? When we think about, we talked a little bit earlier, some of our our kids, whether through foster care, through adoption, biologically. Some of us are parenting kids who have experienced some pretty tough stuff early on in life, and so we've talked at length a billion times in this podcast about the effects of trauma in early childhood, and how it can present in maladaptive behaviors and all of that. But from a very base level, let's talk for a minute about loving our kids who have experienced trauma and loss kind of through a holiday season, and maybe is it a similar roadmap to teaching them to kind of sit with some memories in a positive way, or do you find that there's some different mechanisms for doing that with kids?
Well, I think the power of empathy is huge. I think what we know about trauma is like the importance of that trauma survivor having an opportunity to sit with somebody that they trust, who is the safe person, and who allows them to share their story. A lot of times, I would use with people that I work with sort of like a picture of a balloon, right? It's like, every experience that is traumatic or hard, it's like, another burst of breath into a balloon that just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. It's like every conversation that is healthy and safe, it's like you're letting a little air out of that balloon, little air out of that balloon, little air out of that balloon. And so, I think, these parents who are present and safe and patient and showing love and empathy, and you're never going to do that perfectly.
Sure.
You're not.
Right.
But just showing up and providing that, hey, tell me more. What was that like? Thank you so much for sharing that. Just some of those basic tools. I think it's just invaluable. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I often think, when we're able to be safe, and that picture of the balloon is super, super helpful, because a balloon that is not overinflated can handle some bumps and some pressure. And, you can even sit on a balloon that's not fully inflated, and it'll form out to the side to be able to absorb that blow. Whereas the higher pressure it is, every outside pressure that comes in tends to cause it to pop. And all of us, I think, have experienced that pop within parenting before, moments of unexplained explosion where you're looking around like, what in the world? And it's easy for us to lose sight that balloon is pressurized over time from lots of little interactions. And so, creating space for those conversations is vital. Some of us, and hand raised, myself included, we're traveling over the holidays, different settings. So maybe let's kind of round third and head for home in this line of discussion. We're going to be heading some situations that might be complex for us with our own family background and relationships. Might be complex for our kids based on their relationships with extended family, et cetera. And then when you combine those two things together, so everybody's under one roof, maybe mom and dad have a strained relationship with the in-laws you're staying with or whatever, maybe the kids that are there don't always feel the safest in their environments, whatever. So maybe let's finish with some guidelines or some conversation around the holidays in general and how we can step back to create safe environments for everybody involved going into the holidays.
Well, I think what you just said is so helpful, because what you've just done there, JD, is name like the context that people and families are experiencing. And I think one of the best things families can do together is to be able to say, hey, y'all, here's the deal. We all are in a very stressful time. And when we are in a time like this, maybe in the past, we can lose our tempers together, and actually like have like a family meeting to say, so let's all like regroup and recommit to like being patient and using our words, right? And
Right.
so it's like, I call that like preemptive,
Yeah.
of just saying, okay, so here's what, let's not be victimized by the circumstances. Let's do everything we can to be preemptive and let the adults lead in that, to say, okay, here, we adults in the room, we're aware of that. So, whether it's, a mom and dad or whatever, or a couple, to say, hey, um, let's figure out what that looks like for us.
Yeah.
And then with the children in the home, how can we all together as a family unit commit to that?
Yeah. That's great.
What are just some like lower shelf practices that we can use, if we feel, the tension? Sometimes I use a lot of word pictures, JD, as you know.
Mm-hmm.
I've been to the Niagara Falls, and I always tell people, hey, you know, if you're drifting down Niagara River, right, the time to swim to shore is like a mile or 2 miles upstream. So we're using the current of the Niagara River, as a metaphor here for maybe like dealing with your frustrations,
Yeah.
right? So the time to deal with that is like way upstream, not 100 feet before the falls,
Right. Right. Yeah. You can
because then
hear the
it's too
rush of the
late.
that's right. Yeah.
Because then it's too late. You're like over the falls, and you have to,
Right.
so like how do adults, um self-regulate? Well, you've got to deal with that when you're aware of self, and you can say, hey, I'm beginning to notice myself feeling frustrated, and so let me deal with that, and on an adult level, and how can I best as I can, like model that, and do that in a way that's helpful for the rest of the people in the room.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So last,
God help us.
yeah, seriously, seriously. Um, last thoughts for us today on grieving and on experiencing loss as a family, and anything else that you want to say to us, kind of advice for us for the road as we head out.
I really, I think that part that we talked about, JD, of just, I have another thought, tangential thought I'll come back to, but that part that we talked about, of just, allowing ourselves to embrace and sit in it rather than run from it, is
Mm-hmm.
really important. The tangential part that I thought about, that I want to come back to, is this. You know, we all are like hardwired by God in a different way. You're an Enneagram fan. I'm an Enneagram fan. Um, that's just one. That's just one example of
Yeah.
how we're made differently. I mention that only for this reason. We all grieve differently. We do.
That's helpful.
And
Yeah.
so, how you're gonna deal with the loss of somebody close to you is different than I am. Um, I think what there's some general helpful ways. We don't want to stuff, we don't want to deny, but two people who lost the same loved one are going to live that out differently,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so giving yourself permission not to feel the pressure to grieve exactly like somebody else. Oh, that's the right way. I think giving yourself permission is really, really important. Right.
That's good. Yeah.
I've got a friend who lost somebody, and she's sort of a private person. And so for her, it's, she has a chair in her house, and she's decided to take a certain amount of time, in her week, and just to sit in that chair, that's her grieving chair, and just to sit in that chair and use that time for reflection about her loved one, happens to be her father, and maybe do some journaling and do some writing. And, when she's done in that time, she sort of gets up and kind of goes about her life. She does that because she has a tendency to compartmentalize and not really like give herself time to grieve.
Yeah.
And so she's like, I know I need some way to like block off time or I won't do it. Right.
Yeah.
So that's her way. So, finding different ways that, in a sense are true to the rhythms and like DNA of who you are is important. That's just an example.
That's great. Rocky, thank you so much for being with us today and for sharing this stuff. And I'm gonna cut us off now so that we can take time individually after reading this to kind of think through and process through how we might need to take some steps heading into this season. But thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Great to be with you. Bless you.
Well, I do hope that you found that episode as helpful personally as I did. I know that obviously being friends with Rocky for a long time, there's been lots of conversations like that have garnered some practical truths that have really impacted and been helpful for my own personal life. But I will hold on to that really practical tool of taking memories and thoughts that typically provoke sadness of things or people that we've lost and beginning to not run away from those thoughts, but to sit with them and then begin to honor those memories, those people by attributing kindness to those memories, like thinking with gratitude about the time we did have and beginning to process through moments that we were thankful for with those people and allowing our brains to kind of refile that memory, so to speak, into one that is cherished and that we can become very thankful for. That is obviously easier talked about in the podcast than it is actually done, but it is worth it. So from all of us here at the ETC podcast, for Moentana Ottinger, for the whole team here, for Kyle Wright, who edits and engineers our audio, for Tad Jewett, the creator of the music behind the ETC podcast, I'm JD Wilson. And we will see you next week on the Empowered to Connect podcast.